The day the water came, I was standing on my neighbor's porch watching it happen in real time. Fields that had been green and heavy with crop 2 days before were just gone, swallowed. The whole valley looked like a brown lake with fence posts sticking out of it. And up on the hill, up on that weird, stubborn, ridiculous rooftop garden everyone in town had laughed at for 3 years, Marvella Hutchins was harvesting corn. In the middle of a flood, on a roof. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that moment broke something open in me, because I had been one of the people laughing. Before we go any further, if you enjoy stories like this one, take a second to subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what Marvella did, you have to understand where she came from and what everybody said about her when she first started. Marvella Hutchins was 61 years old, and she had lived on the same stretch of land in Harlan County, Kentucky her entire life. Not the kind of life where you stay in one place because you're comfortable. The kind where you stay because the land is yours and leaving it would feel like leaving a piece of yourself behind in the soil. Her grandfather had worked that land. Her mother had worked it. And Marvella had worked it since she was 7 years old, pulling weeds beside her daddy before the school bus came in the morning. She was a compact woman, short, with wide hands and a face that looked like it had been weathered by about 40 more years than she'd actually lived. That's what outdoor work does to you. But her eyes were sharp, dark brown, quick-moving, the kind of eyes that don't miss much. When she looked at you, you felt like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever you were about to say. She lived alone, had for 11 years since her husband Ray passed from a heart attack at 53. They'd never had kids, not for lack of wanting, just the way things went, and after Ray died, people in town assumed she'd sell the farm and move closer to her sister in Lexington. That's what people assumed. Marvella didn't sell anything. She got up the next morning, pulled on her boots, and went out to work. That's who she was. Her farm was 42 acres. Mostly corn and soybeans, with a small kitchen garden she kept by the back porch for herself, tomatoes, peppers, a few rows of green beans. She drove a 2003 Ford F-150 that she maintained herself. She went to church on Sundays, sat in the third pew on the left, and sang loud enough that the people around her sometimes glanced over. She wasn't embarrassed about it. She said Ray had always loved her singing, and she wasn't about to stop on account of strangers. She had a reputation in Harlan County for being stubborn, which was another way of saying she had a reputation for being right, and people didn't always love her for it. The spring of 2021 was when Marvella first started talking about it. She'd been watching the weather patterns for years, not casually the way most farmers glance at their phone and check the forecast app. Seriously, she kept a handwritten notebook going back to 1987, recording rainfall, temperature swings, first frost dates, dry spells. 34 years of data in her own handwriting, in composition notebooks stacked on the shelf above the kitchen table. And what she was seeing scared her. The floods were getting worse. Not every year, not in a straight line, but the trend was clear if you looked at enough years side by side. The valley floor where most of the county's farmland sat, including her 42 acres, flooded in 2008, in 2013, in 2017, and again in 2019. Each time the water came higher and stayed longer. In 2019, she lost 60% of her corn crop, just drowned in the field. 3 months of work gone in 4 days. She'd filed the insurance claim, she'd taken the payout, she'd replanted what she could and finished the season in the red. But she'd also sat at that kitchen table for a long time afterward, staring at those notebooks, and made a decision. She wasn't going to keep gambling the same way and expecting different results. Her goal wasn't complicated. She wanted to protect her livelihood. She wanted to still be farming at 70, at 75, for as long as her body would let her. She wanted to find a way to grow food that the floodwater couldn't reach. And she had an idea. It was an unusual idea. Most people, when she described it, looked at her the way you look at someone who just said they're planning to drive to the moon. Polite, concerned, quietly wondering if something was wrong. Marvella wanted to build a rooftop garden on top of her barn. Not a small decorative thing with potted herbs, a real growing operation. Raised beds, irrigation, load-bearing reinforcements to the roof structure, soil management, the whole system. Designed to produce enough corn and vegetables to carry her through any season when the valley flooded out. She'd been reading about rooftop agriculture, urban farms in Chicago and New York, hydroponic operations in warehouses, soil weight calculations, drainage systems. She had a yellow legal pad covered in notes and sketches. She'd called an agricultural extension office in Lexington twice and spoken at length with a researcher there who told her the concept was sound, but the execution would be complicated and expensive. She said she understood that. She said she was going to do it anyway. The first person she told locally was her neighbor Dale Purcell, whose farm sat adjacent to hers on the eastern side. Dale was 68, third-generation farmer, and considered himself something of an authority on how things were done in Harlan County. He laughed. Not a small chuckle, a genuine, bent-over, hand-on-the-knee laugh. Then he straightened up, wiped his eye, and said, "Marvella, that is the craziest thing I have ever heard come out of a farmer's mouth, and I have been farming since 1974. She told him she appreciated the feedback. He told everyone. Within 2 weeks, the rooftop garden plan was the main topic of conversation at the feed store, at the diner on Route 9, at the Methodist church where 3 of the county's biggest farming families attended. The reaction was almost universally the same, amusement shading into something less kind. People said she'd lost her mind grieving Ray. People said the 2019 flood losses had broken something in her judgment. One man, whose name I won't use, told someone at the feed store that Marvella Hutchins had always been a little odd, and now she'd gone fully around the bend. She heard all of it. Small towns don't keep secrets well. She started anyway. The financial pressure was real. Reinforcing the barn roof cost her $14,000 that she pulled from savings. The raised bed materials, the specialized growing medium, the irrigation setup, another $9,000. She spent the winter of 2021 and 2022 doing most of the labor herself, hiring 2 men from town for the heavy structural work and doing everything else alone, hauling soil up a modified ramp she built on the side of the barn. Installing drip lines in the cold. Her hands cracked and bled in the dry winter air, and she wrapped them in athletic tape and kept working. Her sister Carol called from Lexington every Sunday and asked her, gently, if she was sure about this. Marvella said yes. Carol said she worried. Marvella said worrying was fine, but it didn't get the irrigation lines laid. Meanwhile, the spring planting season came, and Marvella did something that gave the skeptics more ammunition. She reduced her ground-level corn planting by 1/3, took acreage that had always been in production and left it fallow. The logic was sound. She wanted to reduce her flood exposure on the valley floor and shift some of that production risk to the roof. But from the outside, to people who didn't know her reasoning, it looked like she was losing her grip, farming less ground, wasting money on a barn roof, planting corn 20 feet in the air. By the summer of 2022, people had stopped finding it funny. Now they just found it sad. What nobody knew, what Marvella hadn't told anyone, not even Carol, was that the extension researcher in Lexington had sent her something in March of 2022. A report, 43 pages, put together by a team of climate scientists and agricultural analysts at the University of Kentucky. It was a flood projection study for eastern Kentucky counties, including Harlan. She'd read it 3 times, highlighted it in 2 colors. The projections for the next decade were not good. She kept that report in the kitchen drawer under the notepad. She didn't share it because she knew what would happen. People would say the government was always predicting doom. People would say scientists didn't understand farming. She'd seen that conversation play out enough times to know it went nowhere. So she just worked. But there was something else she kept quiet, something more personal. In the fall of 2022, she found a letter in Ray's old toolbox in the garage. She'd been looking for a specific socket wrench and had pulled the box down from the shelf for the first time in years. Under a layer of tools, wrapped in a shop rag, was an envelope with her name on it in Ray's handwriting. She sat down on the garage floor and didn't move for a while. The letter was dated 2 months before he died. Ray had known something was coming. The doctors had told him his heart wasn't right, though he'd kept the severity from Marvella. He'd written her a letter and tucked it away. She didn't tell me everything he wrote. That was private, and I respected it. But she told me one part. He'd written, "You always see around corners that other people can't even find. Don't let them talk you out of the things you know." She put the letter in the kitchen drawer, next to the flood report. After that, she stopped explaining herself to anyone. The summer of 2022 was dry, which was its own kind of cruel joke. No flood that year, perfect growing conditions on the valley floor. Dale Purcell had a record crop, and he made sure Marvella knew it, not nastily, but with that particular brand of neighborly cheerfulness that lands like a needle. "Good year," he'd say, leaning on the fence between their properties. "Real good year." Marvella's rooftop corn came in smaller than her ground crop would have. The yield was respectable but not exceptional. She was still learning the system, adjusting the soil mix, calibrating the irrigation. It was a first year. First years are always hard. She did the math at the end of the season and came out modestly ahead on the rooftop portion, modestly behind where she'd have been if she'd kept her full ground acreage in production. Net result, she lost money compared to what she could have made if she'd done nothing different. She wrote the numbers in her notebook and went to bed. I know she had hard nights that fall. She told me that later, after everything. She'd lie awake running calculations and asking herself the question you can't avoid when you've made a costly, unconventional decision and the evidence hasn't come in to justify it yet. What if I'm wrong? She wasn't a person who collapsed under doubt, but she wasn't made of stone either. The doubt was there, she just didn't let it make decisions for her. What kept her steady, she said, was the notebooks. She'd get up at 2 in the morning, make coffee, and go back through 30 years of data. Look at the pattern again, not the one good year, the whole sweep of years. And every time, the pattern said the same thing it had always said. The water is coming, it's always been coming, and one good dry year doesn't change what 30 years of data shows. She replanted the roof in spring of 2023, expanded it, learned from the previous year's mistakes. That spring, something shifted in town too. Not the mockery that was still there, quieter now but present. But a younger couple, the Ramseys, who farmed about 20 acres on the east end of the valley, came out to see her set up. They were in their early 30s with 2 small kids, and they'd lost crops in both 2017 and 2019. They walked around her barn, looked up at the raised beds, asked careful questions. Marvella answered all of them. They didn't start a rooftop garden. They couldn't afford the upfront cost right then, but they told her it was the most interesting thing they'd seen in years. She appreciated that more than she let on. July 2023 is when everything shifted. It had been raining since the 3rd week of June. Not constantly, but heavily, repeatedly, the kind of pattern where the ground never fully drains between storms. The creek that ran along the north edge of Harlan County's farming valley was running higher than normal. People were watching it, but nobody was panicking. It had run high before. Then on July 14th, a storm system stalled over eastern Kentucky and didn't move for 3 days. I was in Louisville on business when I got the first call from my uncle, who farmed 20 miles from Marvella. He said the creek had jumped its banks. I drove back that night. What I came home to I still don't have good words for. The valley was gone, not flooded in the way we'd seen before, not a foot of water creeping over the low fields. The water came fast and it came deep, 8 and 9 feet in the lowest areas. Cars moved, fencing disappeared. An equipment shed on Dale Purcell's property floated 20 yards before it snagged on something and broke apart. Across the county, farms that had been in families for generations lost everything in 72 hours. And here is the part nobody expected. Marvella's barn held. The structural reinforcement she'd done 2 years earlier, the work everyone had called unnecessary and expensive. It turned out she'd hired a structural engineer from Lexington who had overbuilt the modifications specifically with flood loading in mind. The barn sat on slightly elevated ground, and she'd had the foundation regraded as part of the project in a way that redirected water flow. None of that had been in the original plan. She'd added it after the engineer raised concerns during his assessment. She hadn't mentioned any of that to anyone. People assumed the rooftop garden was the whole project. It wasn't. She'd quietly flood-hardened the entire structure. But that wasn't the real twist. The real twist was the seeds. 3 weeks before the flood, Marvella had started quietly distributing seed packets to 6 farming families in the county. Heirloom corn varieties, drought and flood-resistant strains she'd sourced from a seed library in Berea, Kentucky that she'd been in contact with for 2 years. She'd left bags on porches with handwritten notes, no explanation beyond the variety name and planting instructions. The Ramsey family had planted theirs in elevated raised beds they'd built on their own, a small version, put together cheaply with salvaged materials after Marvella had walked them through the basics one afternoon. Their bed survived the flood. When the water receded and the Ramseys found their seedlings still standing, Tina Ramsey called Marvella and cried on the phone for 10 minutes. Marvella said, "I know, honey, I know. Let me paint you the picture of the day I drove out to her place after the water pulled back. It was a Wednesday morning, 6 days after the worst of it. The sky had gone pale blue and almost peaceful, which felt wrong against everything below it. The road out to her property was coated in a thick skin of dried mud, reddish-brown, with debris lines on the fences marking how high the water had reached, in some stretches 8 feet or higher. Her driveway was passable, barely. My truck slid twice in the soft mud. When I pulled up, she was on the roof of the barn. She was moving down the rows of raised beds, checking plants, pinching dead leaves, making notes in a small spiral notebook she kept in her breast pocket. She wore a wide-brimmed hat against the morning sun, and her boots were caked in dried mud from whatever she'd been doing at ground level earlier. Her movements were calm and methodical, not triumphant, just working. Around her, you could see the full picture of what had happened to the valley. Dale Purcell's field, which had been chest-high green corn 2 weeks before, was a flat brown wasteland. The plants were gone, compressed into a layer of sediment. Equipment sat at odd angles where the current had pushed it. The fence line between his property and Marvella's was strung with debris, branches, plastic bags, strips of tarp, a child's sneaker. And above all of that, 20 feet off the ground, Marvella's corn was green. The ears weren't fully mature yet, but they were close. The stalks stood straight in the morning air. Against the brown devastation of the valley, the color was almost shocking, like someone had put it there deliberately to make a point. I called up to her, she looked down, nodded once, and kept working. When she climbed down, her face was tired but composed. The lines around her eyes were deeper than I remembered. She poured 2 cups of coffee from a thermos she'd left on a sawhorse and handed me one without asking. She said, "I've got calls from 9 farms wanting to know how I did it." I said I wasn't surprised. She said, "I've also got Dale coming over this afternoon." I asked what she thought he'd say. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked back out at the valley. The morning light caught the mud in a way that made it look almost like water still. "He'll say he wants to know," she said, "so I'll tell him." Dale Purcell showed up at 4 o'clock that afternoon. I was still there. He drove his truck slow down the driveway, which alone told you something. Dale was a fast driver normally. He parked and got out and stood for a moment looking up at the roof. He'd probably driven past her barn 1,000 times over the past 2 years, but he was looking at it differently now. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with white hair and a tan so deep it had stopped looking like a tan and started looking like the natural color of his skin. He walked to where Marvella was standing near the barn entrance with his hat in his hands. He'd taken it off, which I'd rarely seen him do outdoors. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "I lost everything, Marvella." She said, "I know." He said, "I lost the whole crop. The shed's gone. I had a piece of equipment go under and I don't know yet if it's salvageable." He paused. "My granddaddy built that shed." She said, "I know that too." He looked at her. His jaw was working in that way people's jaws work when they're holding something down. "I laughed at you," he said. "I told everybody at the feed store." He stopped. "That was wrong of me. I want you to know I know that." Marvella didn't say it was fine. She didn't say he'd had no way of knowing. She didn't do any of the social softening that would have made the moment easier on both of them. She just received the apology and let it be what it was. She said, "You want me to show you how I built it?" He put his hat back on. "Yeah, I do." So she walked him through the whole thing, 2 hours from foundation to rooftop. She showed him the engineer's specifications. She showed him the seed varieties and explained where she'd sourced them. She walked him through the irrigation system, the soil mixture, the drainage design. She talked about what had worked in year 1 and what she'd changed in year 2. Dale asked careful questions. He took notes in a small notebook he'd brought. I noticed that and thought it said something about him. At the end, standing back on the ground in the late afternoon light, he looked up at the rooftop beds one more time. He said, "How much did it run you total?" She told him. He was quiet. "Then that's a lot of money up front." She said, "It is, but I've still got a crop." He nodded slowly, looked out at his flattened field, looked back at her. "I'm going to need to know who that structural engineer was," he said. She'd already written the name and number on a piece of paper. She held it out to him. He took it. What happened in the year after the flood would take longer to tell properly than I have space for here, but I'll give you the shape of it. By the following spring, 11 farms in Harlan County had reached out to Marvella for guidance on elevated growing systems. Not all of them were doing full rooftop operations. The cost was a barrier for most. But she'd worked with the Extension office in Lexington to develop a lower-cost raised bed system that could sit on elevated platforms at ground level, with foundation drainage modifications. It wasn't as flood-proof as her rooftop setup, but it was meaningfully better than what most valley farms had been doing. Dale Purcell rebuilt. He started his own rooftop system over the following summer, smaller than Marvella's but designed with the same engineer. He talked about it openly in town. Given who he was and how loudly he dismissed her project before, his endorsement carried weight that her own words never could have, and she knew it. She didn't hold that irony against him. She was glad for the help. The Ramsey family became something like Marvella's informal apprentices over those months. Josh and Tina, with their 2 kids, spent enough time at her farm that the children started calling her Miss Marvella and trailing behind her while she worked. She didn't mind. She said she liked the company. The seed library in Berea formalized a partnership with her that fall. She became a distribution point for flood-resilient heirloom varieties for eastern Kentucky farming families, a role she carried out from her kitchen table with the same composition notebooks she'd always used, now filling up with new data about which varieties performed best in which conditions. Her sister Carol came out from Lexington in September. She walked around the farm, stood on the roof and looked out at the valley and was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Ray would have loved this." Marvella said, "I know, he sort of told me to." Carol didn't fully understand what she meant by that, but she didn't push. "I've thought about Marvella Hutchins a lot in the 2 years since the flood. I think about the 34 years of notebooks, the $23,000 she spent when everyone around her was laughing, the nights she got up at 2 in the morning to look at data instead of giving in to doubt, the letter in Ray's toolbox, the seed packets left on porches 3 weeks before the water came." She didn't know the flood was coming in July 2023. She wants me to be clear about that. She wasn't a prophet. She didn't have information nobody else had access to. The University of Kentucky report was public. The weather patterns were visible to anyone who'd been paying attention. She just watched, and she believed what she saw. The thing that stays with me, the thing I keep coming back to, is how much it costs to be right before the evidence arrives. Anyone can say "I told you so" after the flood. The hard part is hauling soil up a ramp in February while your neighbor's at the diner telling people you've lost your mind. The hard part is running the numbers on a year where you came out behind and choosing to plan again in the spring. The hard part is letting people laugh and keeping your hands moving anyway. Marvella told me once, not long after everything, that she didn't think of what she'd done as bravery. She said, "I just looked at what the data said and then I did the work. That's all farming ever is." Maybe, but I've known a lot of farmers, and I've seen a lot of data, and the gap between knowing what the data says and actually doing the work, that gap is where most people stop. Marvella Hutchins didn't stop. And when the water came up to the eaves and every farm in the valley went under, her corn stood green and tall 20 feet in the air, in the July Kentucky sun, exactly where she'd put it. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more like it. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from and what part of this story stayed with you most. I read as many comments as I can, and I genuinely enjoy hearing from you.